Just wanted to make a few final comments on our discussion for Unit 4. Once again, you all did a good job of interacting in a collegial way with one another in talking about each other's ideas rather than anything else, and so I wanted to again applaud you for that. I also wanted to just remind you, if you are still having trouble making the distinction between referencing the readings and citing evidence from the readings, please let me know. I'm more than happy to help with that. So what we're trying to do here on the discussion board is not just point to the reading or the video where you got the idea from, but instead to kind of pull out that idea as evidence and actually talk about the idea itself or the event, the action, whatever it is that you're using as evidence for your responses to one another. So I just wanted to comment on that. As I've been liking to do recently, I want to lead with an extra credit opportunity. For up to 20 points extra credit, please respond to this video. Respond to the post of this video that I put on the discussion board. The question that I have is really asking you to compare Padre Martinez and Donaciano Vigil. Both were people who lived in New Mexico during the transition from Spanish colony to New Mexico as part of the Mexican nation to New Mexico being part of the United States. Both of them handled that situation quite differently, as we read about in the Mile. And so I want you to kind of go back and review that, and if you would like some extra credit, please make that comparison between the two men and decide which of the two you think kind of handled the situation best and why. All right, so if you want that extra credit opportunity, please just go ahead and respond to this video on the discussion board. Again, you can take that in any direction you want. The requirement, though, is that you draw on specific evidence from the Mile to support your ideas. Just a couple of comments about our discussion for Unit 4. I think we did a good job of looking at Bent's Fort and thinking about how the Santa Fe trade helped to pull New Mexico, at least economically, or I should say especially economically, toward the United States. It created a relationship of trade that was a lot closer with the U.S. Than it was perhaps with Mexico anymore. And that was an important shift during the Mexican period. So between 1821 and 1848, the Santa Fe trade was the key element of New Mexico's economy in a lot of ways. And of course, for that reason, New Mexico started to gravitate toward the United States. Also, as we read just a little bit about, Governor Armijo tended to favor providing new land grants to Anglo-Santa Fe traders. This was something that Padre Martinez was furious about, something that Armijo thought would help hold New Mexico against nomadic people and so on. And so there was a debate about that at the time. But either way, it started to put more and more land in the hands of Anglo newcomers. And as we'll see following the war during the U.S. territorial period that we're starting to study this week, land issues became more and more heated and problematic. And of course, land grants are still problematic to this day. And so we'll start to think about why so much controversy has arisen around those, starting with that period in the mid-19th century. Thinking about the U.S.-Mexico War itself, I think it is very telling that here in the United States, we talk about it as the U.S.-Mexico War, the Mexican-American War, the War with Mexico, those kind of bland descriptors, whereas people in Mexico refer to it as the War of North American Invasion. They very clearly believe, and as we've read about and studied, they have some good reason to believe that the United States invaded their country and took nearly half of their national territory from them in a war of conquest. That's very different than the narrative that is spun by Americans who are talking about manifest destiny, which is an amorphous ideology that really kind of refers to this idea that Americans believed they had a God-given right to push forward from sea to shining sea, as it was, to take control of lands in North America all the way to the Pacific coast. Of course, there were a lot of pragmatic and also not so highly idealized reasons for making that kind of expansion. But for that reason, we have this tendency not to think of the US-Mexico War much at all today in our historical memory as a society. And we certainly don't think of it, or it's never really cast as a war of conquest. Again, I want to propose that that's exactly what it was. If we look at a lot of the functions of what was going on during the US-Mexico War, even with the way that New Mexico was occupied by Kearny's Army of the West, we see that there are a lot of kind of analogs between that time period and the time period of Spanish conquest. Of course, the missionization wasn't a key driver of what was going on. With the American conquest, trade was much more prominent, but military force was here. It is true that Kearny was able to make a negotiation with Governor Armijo. A bribe is what most people believe happened behind closed doors in order to arrive without firing a shot and take control of Las Vegas and Santa Fe, establish the Kearny Code, which essentially shut out Nuevo Mexicanos from governance. But he overstepped his bounds. He didn't have the right to bring New Mexicans into U.S. citizenship, which was something he claimed he did. That would have to come later with the treaty and with the approval of the United States Congress. But also, there was a lot of opposition to the American presence. So again, we need to remember that after Kearny's occupation, a lot else happened. Beginning in earnest in January of 1847, the Taos Revolt took place. Charles Bent, of course, the governor put in power by Kearny, attempted to go to his home in Taos to address the situation. He was killed in a very gruesome way there. All too often, the Taos Revolt has been discussed historically by historians outside of its actual context. So usually it's thought of in the context of, well, New Mexico is part of the United States at this point. These were people kind of locally who were revolting against the local government and so on, but that doesn't really get what was going on. The United States and Mexico were still at war with one another. The war wasn't officially over until March of 1848 when the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was ratified, and that meant that everything that was going on in New Mexico in 1847 was war. It was part of the war effort. Nuevo Mexicanos thought of it in that way, by and large. They were getting support from officials in Chihuahua to continue the fight and try to push Americans out of New Mexico. Excuse me, a little bit of allergies. And so they were continuing the fight. Sterling Price, when he tried and executed some of those behind the revolt for treason, he was reprimanded by President Polk because those people were not American citizens. They weren't committing treason. We were at war at that time. So again, the idea that New Mexico just fell to the United States bloodlessly isn't really true. There was a lot of resistance in various ways. Something to think about as we go forward into the next unit as well is how different things might be resistance. And I mentioned this in Chapter 8, but it's a theme that we'll keep running with. Some Chicano scholars have pointed out that people like Donaciano Vigil were resisting the New Order by becoming part of it. They were actually able to preserve some of their culture. They were able to protect certain rights for their people by taking that kind of a step. Of course, others might call them sellouts. And so it's important to think about what was really going on here. How should we best, or how can we best interpret it? Let's see. One last thing, of course, the border crossed us. We're talking about how the river itself was the Rio Bravo, meaning it was strong-willed and stubborn, changed course in 1849, and created a lot of problems for people in Doña Ana and in the colonies that are today, or I should say the towns that are today essentially suburbs of El Paso. We had Isleta and so forth, all of those people who moved across to Guadalupe after the river changed course. Repatriation was something the Mexican government wanted to do to protect the rights of its people. They didn't really ever support it very well, though. They set aside some funds. They sent Padre Ortiz to New Mexico to try to register people to move to Mexico. But again, it was something that a lot of people wanted to do, but those who actually did it had to foot the bill themselves. Again, good intentions don't always translate into actual policies or actions. But it also is interesting to think about why Americans were resisting that. There was reason to try to keep people in New Mexico in order to keep the population threshold up, in order to keep a sort of tax base in the area as capitalism was becoming more and more the economic system of the day. So anyway, I think hopefully that this kind of summarizes and captures a lot of the complexities of the historical debates around the War of North American Invasion, or the U.S.-Mexico War. It gets us thinking more and more about what this event means for us as a nation, but also for us here in this region in New Mexico.